So thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing okay. Did you have a good weekend? Okay, great. Thanks a lot for being here with us. So my name is Charles Autheman. I'm one of the two lecturers for the final class of this course that we've been having for 12 weeks called National and International Initiatives to Advance the SDGs Decent Work Agenda. It's the final class is coming at a very, very timely moment today, 24 April, for a number of reasons. We're going to focus on two of them with some students that have volunteered to prepare the session with me, or actually to prepare the session. I was just enjoying the weekend. So today is the 10-year anniversary of Rana Plaza. Rana Plaza is a building, was a building in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, but it's also a foundational moment in the recent history of what we call business and human rights, how we've come to understand the adverse impact that business activities can have on human rights and labor rights, and we'll try to understand that during the first hour. We have a guest speaker coming from Lausanne and Genève. Dorothée, thanks a lot for being with us. I'll introduce Dorothée in a second. Just to tell you as well that today or this week is also going to be an important moment at the European Parliament with regards to ongoing legislation around CSDD. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that, but around 11 or so, a member of the European Parliament, Raphael Glucksmann, who is the vice chair of the subcommittee on human rights, will join us, and he'll walk us through a little bit what's going on in the European Union around these issues. And you'll see Rana Plaza, CSDD are connected. Merzouk and Kuan Yu will lead that conversation, and thanks to them for that. Today, I think also, or maybe last Friday, Xavier knows better, was the beginning of the G7 ministerial meeting for labor and employment issues in Japan. So this is why Zineb Mekwa is not with us today, because she's in Japan. Zineb usually teaches the class with me. And just for everyone to know that, yeah, this class that we've been doing is around important labor issues and how they're being discussed at policy level. We've talked a lot about the International Labour Organization, how these issues are being talked within the ILO, but also the G7, the G20, and all the discussion around it. Maybe just before I hand over the floor to Shannon Arialis, maybe ask you to take 30 seconds just to remember the victims of this tragedy. It's quite a sad day that we are commemorating today. Over 1,000 people lost their lives. More than 2,000 people were wounded. So if we can take just 30 seconds to think of them, their families, and everyone who's suffering injustices in the world of work. Okay, thank you for that. Shannon, Arialis, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hope you guys can hear me okay. I'll try to speak up for those in the back. As Charles mentioned, today is the 10-year anniversary of the Rana Plaza tragedy, in which over 1,000 individuals lost their lives and another 2,500 were wounded. I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the details, including that tragedy, before posing some questions and working about the impact of Rana Plaza. So, as Charles mentioned before as well, this was a building in Bangladesh that housed numerous factories all within the same 8-9-story building. up to, I think, over 20 fast fashion companies were also implicated in the tragedy. This was a building that, yes, was a huge powerhouse behind the garment industry itself. The building had numerous safety and health concerns. After the day before the collapse, there were cracks that had appeared in the structure of the building. Workers voiced their concerns, and they were actually threatened with withheld pay the day that the building eventually did collapse, if they did not come to work. And so the massive scale of this tragedy really prompted a global conversation surrounding occupational safety and health standards, which now exists as a fundamental right under the International Labour Organization framework. But that has not always been the case. And I'll just define occupational safety and health for the group so we're all on the same page. Occupational safety and health is defined as the science of the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of hazards arising in or from the workplace that could impair the health and well-being of workers, taking into account the possible impact on the surrounding communities and the general environment. So this is the conversation that we're having in the wake of this tragedy. And the first question for Dorothy would be, what have you observed? As the main challenges in ensuring occupational safety and health as a result of this tragedy, and to what extent has the Rana Plaza disaster been successful in garnering international attention and action?
Thank you all for having me, and it's so encouraging to see so many of you here. At the time of the collapse, I think many of you were still so young that you couldn't fully process the news. I was already working in the field, and as the Rana Plaza building collapsed, there had been many warning signs, not just the day before. It actually followed a series of accidents that happened in Bangladesh and fires that had already killed garment workers. And as this happened for a brief moment in time, I would say international attention was on Bangladesh, not because of a natural disaster, but something that was man-made and that I think highlighted structural issues in global supply chains that resulted in this tragedy. And just a few weeks prior to this tragedy at NYU Stern, we founded the NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights, which at the time was the first and also only human rights center at a business school. And our idea at the time was to make sure that the next generation of business leaders also knows how to manage human rights risks. And then Rana Plaza happened. And it was tragic, but it also underlined the urgency of our project. To your question, after Rana Plaza, I'll get to the second part of your question first. We saw unprecedented collaboration amongst international fashion brands, something that arguably should have happened sooner, but the tragedy galvanized indeed international collaboration. Over 200 brands joined what's called the Bangladesh Accord, and about 25, mostly American brands joined a parallel organization called the Bangladesh Alliance. Both had very similar objectives, namely to make Bangladesh's garment industry safe and sustainable. That was the declared objective. And the fact that they wanted to collaborate on this big objective, I think is very, very positive. The two organizations, however, then focused, and now I'm getting to your question, what were the challenges of establishing organizational health and safety at the workplace in Bangladesh? They focused very narrowly on fire safety and structural integrity of the building. So out of the many health and safety issues in the garment industry, they picked out a very narrow slice, namely fire safety and building safety. Yet, if you look at the broad definition that you gave of health and safety at the workplace, you also need to consider that workers in these factories are exposed to other risks, including mental health issues. And it's an incredibly stressful job to work on piece rate. Sexual harassment is quite common in these factories. If you work on piece rate and your machine breaks down, you lose income. So you need a mechanic to fix your machine. And if there, a number of people whose machines have broken down and you want to get into the queue or jump the queue, offering a sexual favor to the mechanic may help. So these things are quite common in garment factories, and of course have been not on the agenda of Accord or Alliance. In addition, this is something that NYU Stern focused on, was the fact that the Accord and the Alliance both worked with the factories with whom fashion brands had a direct contractual sourcing relationship. And that led to a universe of around like 3,000 factories in the country. But according to our estimates, and we spent, I would say, years counting factories in Bangladesh, there were many, many more factories in Bangladesh that produced garments for export. So why is that so? Because the garment factories in Bangladesh, as I said, they're under tremendous pressure to work ever faster, ever cheaper. And in the past years, the prices for garments have actually been falling. And so as these pressures accumulate, they're all put on the shoulders of manufacturers, and those manufacturers then need to find ways to get the job done. And often this led to so-called subcontracting, unauthorized subcontracting. So the production wasn't produced at the so-called first-tier direct supplier with whom the brand had a contractual relationship, but at many other facilities, sort of like little, we use the metaphor of spoken and of a wheel, with spokes, and every direct factory has on average 30 to 50 subcontractors. And that universe of subcontractors was completely left out of the organizational structures and reach and scope of Accord and Alliance. So thematically, it was limited. Also, in terms of the scope of factories that they looked at, it was quite limited. And the method through which they wanted to improve compliance with labor standards was also limited in that they again did inspections. So more inspections, something that we've seen in the years prior to Rana Plaza, didn't really work to fully establish labor standards. It was a top-down method to just, record all the things that go wrong in the factory without fully understanding why do these things go wrong? How can we effectively remediate those problems? And another, I would say, governance challenge of Accord and Alliance was the fact that the actors that had to implement all these corrective measures based on the results from inspections were not part of the governance of Accord and Alliance. So the local manufacturers, the people that own the factories and then had to organize the remediation and pay for the remediation, were not had no seat at the table to discuss how to best approach factory safety. And as a result, it was a polarizing approach, which I think has changed a lot of factory owners that often didn't fully understand some remedial measures that were required by the inspectors. And it again became a cat and mouse game that I think you cannot win. It's about changing, the mindsets and making people understand the benefits of such remedial measures. So now that the Accord has left Bangladesh and has been handed over to a Bangladeshi-owned initiative, the question is, will they be upholding the standards? Did the Accord and the Alliance actually change the debate about health and safety to a degree that now there's a real legacy from these major efforts? And I want to be clear about that. The top of the industry in Bangladesh has certainly become much, much safer. Building and fire safety has improved tremendously thanks to the efforts of brands through Accord and Alliance. But the issues left out of the scope of those initiatives still need to be addressed. So I can see this as the major challenge, and also ensuring the legacy of Accord and Alliance now that these initiatives have sort of phased out, to make sure that the Bangladeshi-owned initiative keeps up the standards. They don't have the best track record of doing this, so we don't want to see backsliding in terms of the things that have been achieved.
Thank you. And that fits in with our next question.
But before I ask you that, I'll give you a bit of a background. So we've been talking a lot about international apparel companies, and also it's important to highlight a lot of these companies rely on offshoring for their supplies because of the low wage in countries. We know that from the media, and it's a very common knowledge nowadays, I would say. However, the low wage and low cost production that these brands and retailers have sought, as you mentioned before, it comes with a cost specifically on workers. And there's a lot of power imbalances. You mentioned the sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And with that, and it's really common in the sector that there is this linkage between the heightened risks of gender-based violence as well as having short-term contracts for employees and not having a living wage. And creating a work and safe environment that is safe requires more than just preventing injuries, but it requires having more employee well-being as a priority. So our next question for you is, what are the risks associated with the current outsourcing model in the garment industry? And are there any specific vulnerabilities?
Yes. Number of vulnerabilities. But let me take a step back and again use Rana Plaza to highlight to you how Rana Plaza represents an emblematic case for the dynamics of global supply chains. So clearly garment production moved to countries where labor costs are fairly cheap. Why? Because the fixed costs of garment production are almost unalterable, in terms of energy cost. You need you need some structure, you need some machines, you need input raw materials, and those costs, you cannot change much about them, but the labor costs are most malleable and they can also best be squeezed. And as production moved often to developing countries, and Bangladesh is the second largest garment producing country in the world after China, of course, brands were then exposed to contexts where governments are either unable or unwilling to protect very basic human rights. Rana Plaza, interesting in that this building that collapsed was actually built on marshland. So it had 8 stories, but the foundation wasn't solid in the first place. I don't know who gave out the building permits at the time. Also, the building was authorized to have 6 floors, but 2 floors were added. Why? Because the garment factories needed more space. On top of that, the building producing garments, requires electricity, and the electrical grid in Bangladesh is notoriously overstretched, and the short circuits often led to fires in factories. So to balance out the inconsistent power supply in the country, all the garment factories bought diesel generators. These are heavy machines. And the Rana Plaza context, they put those on the top floors, very heavy machinery. And the diesel generators, as they, as power was cut, the diesel generators jumped on and they rattled. And over weeks and months and years, that affected the building integrity and cracks started appearing. So you could ask, where's the labor inspectorate in a country like Bangladesh? Very, very weak. In the monsoon months, labor inspectorate had no means of transport of getting to some of the factories. They were also paid so little that they sometimes arrived at a factory and told the manufacturer, if you want a good report, pay me something extra. So it shows you what type of context Western businesses moved into. And one problem is that while I think outsourcing of production creates fantastic opportunities, also development opportunities, potentially. I'm not against outsourcing, but I'm certainly not a fan of outsourcing production and outsourcing responsibility for the conditions of production. And this is unfortunately what happens so frequently.
Thank you very much. Kind of building off of that question with regards to like the international nature of these supply chains and our recent globalized world. Let's pose a question about the impact of COVID-19. So as we know, the pandemic has created a variety of supply chain disruptions worldwide. Various governments have attempted to deal with this in a myriad of different ways. Some governments have used stimulus packages and other protection mechanisms to try to maintain wages for some workers. However, as we know, this varies country to country. And when we're talking about outsourcing models, not all workers are going to be protected by such means. Also, with limited resources, governments often don't have the capability to adequately protect all workers. So kind of building off of that, I'm curious to hear what the impact of COVID-19 has been on transforming business models, specifically within the garment industry.
Sure. So I'll be referring to work that has been done by my NYU colleague, Natasha Sharif and Hannah Rosenfeld. They just
It's behind you, though. Okay.
oh, excellent. Yeah. They just published this new report, A Broken Partnership, where they looked indeed at the occasion of the 10-year anniversary of Rana Plaza, like how are things going today for workers? And they looked very deeply into the business models, because in 2014, I published a report with a different NYU colleague entitled Business as Usual is Not an Option. And this report in a way looks at like, is business as usual ongoing, or has it effectively changed? I would say the pandemic, unfortunately, it's like, you know, we moved a step forward and then with the pandemic, 2 steps back to a certain degree, because those purchasing practices, meaning the way how brands place orders in a country like Bangladesh, has tremendous impact on the well-being of workers. Why? Because if you demand ever shorter lead times, ever lower prices, eventually those pressures translate to workers. I earlier said the price, you know, or the cost of workers is the one malleable cost factor, and it eventually squeezes workers, because if a brand makes a last-minute design change, let's say here in Paris says we want the green buttons, not the blue buttons, the manufacturer in Bangladesh has to then order the blue buttons. And the workers then need to speed up production, and they probably have to work overtime. And when you work overtime, everyone gets tired. So accidents happen more frequently. And the supervisors get stressed and start yelling at the workers. So harassment happens more frequently. So it has a knock-on effect, decisions on the top, down to the weakest link of the supply chain, the workers that are often not fully understood. What happened with the pandemic? The brands again demanded incredible flexibility from their manufacturers. So as shops were closed here in Paris, many of the fashion brands argued, well, force majeure, we cannot, you know, accept the orders that you have already produced. We maybe can't even pay for it. There was a major backlash against that, and some then had to pay. But the initial reaction was, again, let's drop the ball on the weakest link of the supply chain, namely our suppliers that produce our stuff. And new purchasing practices were introduced, such as I order an X amount of goods from you, but then a couple of months later, the brand asks to only ship half of the order, because they realized we maybe ordered too much. We actually wanted first part 1, then part 2. That has implications for the manufacturer. The boxes are ready for shipment. Where should they store the boxes safely so that the goods don't go bad? They mold, you know, they need a decent place. So they have to rent a warehouse. So the manufacturer asks the brand, will you pay for the warehousing costs? No, your problem, right? Then after another couple of months, as they are ready to ship the second half, the brand all of a sudden demands a discount on the goods that are already produced. So basically they don't want to pay the agreed upon price anymore, because maybe this is a piece that doesn't go so well with consumers and they want to sell it on sale already. So they pass on that to the manufacturer. And because not all goods have been shipped yet, the brand argues, well, we won't make any payments to you yet, which then creates a cash flow problem on the manufacturer side, meaning a problem to actually pay wages of workers. So there are a lot of knock-on effects that brands don't fully understand, and practices that sort of became compromise solutions to get through the pandemic. They festered And what the two little anecdotes I just told you, they're from like a couple of months ago. My colleagues went to Bangladesh and talked to manufacturers, and this is what they heard. This is now common practice again to, demand for discounts, delay payments, and all of that has not been affected workers. And understanding these direct connections between decisions on top and the weakest link of the supply chain, it seems like this hasn't really come through yet. And so I'm not sure where we are in terms of workers' well-being right now. On top, there are macroeconomic developments such as major inflation. And you may know that after Rana Plaza, the legal minimum wage for garment workers in Bangladesh went up, but often the wage increase was immediately eaten up by higher cost of living, and landlords increased rents the moment their workers had a higher income. So bottom line, are workers better off? I'm really not sure. And this is concerning because the outsourcing model, I say, could potentially create opportunities for the developing world. But if the business models lock workers into situations where they're essentially working poor, meaning they work full time, but they cannot work themselves out of deep, deep poverty, then I'm questioning, if this is the way globalization should work. It's certainly not in line with Agenda 2030 that argues no one should be left behind in a global economy.
Let's remember the minimum wage right now, it was elevated to 75, the equivalent of $75 right, in the ready-made garment industry.
Yeah.
The living wage, I think, is calculated around $215. So there's quite a big shift. And actually, the request from the workers is to get closer to that living wage, but we're really, really far from that.
Yeah.
On that note, we also wanted to delve into multiple stakeholders, specifically to see ways that we can potentially mitigate these challenges and collaborate. And as some of you may know, in 2011, the UN established the guiding principles on business and human rights, which is something that we've been talking about in some previous questions. But to specify what this UN Business on Human Rights does, it articulates the general responsibilities for governments and companies when they're engaging in business practices. And many multinational corporations and companies have developed their own mechanisms as well to be more in guidelines with these voluntary reporting systems, as well as environmental and social efforts. And for instance, as you mentioned, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh was established following the Rana Plaza collapse, but also the duty of villages legislation in countries like France have following the strategy and mandating companies to set up a villages plan so that it contains more responsible and adequate measures for even identifying risks and safer business practices. So overall, there's been more wide and public attention in these areas, but as you mentioned, there are still a lot of challenges. So our final question for you is, how can we effectively include multiple stakeholders in dialogue and standard setting surrounding due diligence legislation? And what avenues exist to expand access to remedy for workers whose rights are violated?
Multi-stakeholder first, remedy afterwards. So as I said before, I think the unprecedented collaboration after Rana Plaza was very, very positive. In general, I don't think these issues cannot be solved by any actor alone. They're just too big. I mean, who's in charge of updating the electrical grid in Bangladesh to eliminate probably a root cause for many of the factory fires? Certainly not an individual brand, but we've advocated for what we call shared responsibility, indeed, where a much, much broader set of stakeholders need to come together, also broader than the ones that are currently integrated in a quarter aligned. It can't just be the garment industry. It probably needs to go beyond that, and also includes the government of Bangladesh and the BGMEA, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association. And to me, the specific case of manufacturing in Bangladesh, garment manufacturing, those garment manufacturers need to be at the table. And an individual brand, I think what they can do is sit with their manufacturers and understand the manufacturer situation and create what I would call actual partnerships at eye level to take out some of the power imbalances that are built into this outsourcing model. And, you know, we pointed out in our reports that some brands started doing that. Not because they're nice, but also because it makes good business sense. Why? Because as I mentioned, if a brand has a change of heart in the terms of which color button they want to put on a shirt, that might only be possible if they actually have direct communication lines with the supplier. And as they can discuss these changes and the implications, you know, such flexibilities might be possible. You actually have an exchange about how to work together rather than I dump this on you and you figure it out. And so this engagement with directly with suppliers is certainly a business model we recommend. Also an engagement that doesn't just last one order, which is typically 3, maybe 6 months, but that lasts longer term. So longer term business relationships with suppliers make good business sense, and they also give the implementation of human rights at the manufacturer level a chance. I mean, all these brands put up codes of conduct, but unless you stick around for a little bit longer, I mean, it's really just words on paper. And so these strategic partnerships that last longer, that you know, establish an eye-level conversation about how to work together, how to grow together, and how to be successful together. We've seen that with some brands. I wrote a case study about a French sports retailer, Decathlon, that has sort of, I think, the most advanced version of this type of partnership. H&M also works quite closely with their suppliers in Bangladesh. They bring them all together at the beginning of the year and give them some order forecasts so that they know what's coming. And so I think these types of engagements point in the right direction. But many structural issues, no brand alone can solve. So one-on-one, a brand can work with their suppliers and change their purchasing model to a more partnership-based model. But structural issues such as the labor inspectorate, the electrical grid, other infrastructure issues, that I think need to come under a much broader umbrella of shared responsibility, where also international aid organizations and foreign governments support upgradings, I would say. Yeah.
And then what about
Remedy? I won't get around that. So remedy is a particularly sad topic because after Rana Plaza, even after Rana Plaza, brands were not really, you know, forthcoming about providing, let's say, compensation for the lost lives. It took the ILO major efforts to actually put together a fund that would compensate some of the victims. And generally, remedy, I think, is right now patchwork, and I expect it to remain a patchwork in terms of where can victims go to if they have any grievances. Not just fatal accidents, but there might be other things such as harassment or, you know, unpaid overtime. And the Accord and Alliance, they both established hotlines where workers could call up. And I think the Alliance hotline worked particularly well. It really had the trust of workers. It was actually used. So this is a positive example of sort of a direct link between workers' grievances and then a reporting channel to brands. I also think that to a certain degree, the digitalization of global supply chains may help with remedy in the future. So for example, if all these sewing machines nowadays are digital, right? So they're producing data. So with the Internet of Things, an auditor could actually look at the machine running times and then compare them to the hours of work record. And if the machine was running in the middle of the night, but the hours of work record doesn't show that, well, the auditor should ask what was going on there. Were you producing stuff in the middle of the night and you didn't pay workers for it? So I think there are new ways of potentially improving the remedy situation. And of course, I mean, ultimately, governments should provide access to judicial system, but I'm afraid we cannot wait for that to happen in most contexts. So we need to rely on a patchwork remedy system also in the future, and hopefully improve access through many possible channels for victims. I think that's most likely, yeah.
And I mean, it's worth noting, we mentioned this last week when we were preparing this class with the students, that I mean, asking oneself, is anyone behind bars currently because of Rana Plaza? And actually the last person that was in jail came out of jail last week on bail. It's actually the owner of the building. So that was the last person. A lot of the people involved in this crime, I think maybe we can describe it as a crime. And some, I mean, as you were describing it, you know, how the building was set up and the number of floors and just how it was run. A lot of them were not prosecuted. For those who were, the charges were very, very, very small. I mean, it kind of shows, and maybe this is something we'll touch upon later when we speak with Rafael Glucksmann, but the challenges that we have in actually defining what it means to be responsible. Now you say, yeah, multi-stakeholder initiatives can be a good format of shared responsibility. In a lot of scenarios, what we've been looking at is also kind of a dilution of responsibility where no one is responsible. So as you bring that home and reflect that with everything that you're studying at Sciences Po, I think it's important to look back at these dramatic events, also to try and, you know, analyze them and say, okay, well, if I'm in a decision-making position in the future, what difference can I make to make sure, you know, what can I unpack and understand? Because a lot of things can be unpacked. We wanted to move maybe to take 10-15 minutes of questions from all of you. Maybe some of you have some questions here. Just before that, I wanted to mention, so as Dorothée was saying, this research came out from NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. I really encourage you to look at it. Really, I mean, it's quite accessible, I think. It does a good effort at bringing historical contexts. In 1978, Bangladesh was exporting $69,000 worth of goods, so basically nothing. In 2022, it's more than $40 billion US. So the country has been completely transformed. The share of exports of the GDP of this country that relies on garment is just huge today. So, but I think, as Natasha and the co-authors say, the relationship, the power dynamic between buyers and suppliers is still very unfair. The second report came out over the weekend, I think. A podcast is going to come out. I read it though. Couldn't wait for the podcast to come out. It's by Sanchita Saxena and Salil Tripathi, and it's really interesting. It touches a lot on this pandemic, what we've learned from the pandemic. Maybe a lot of the issues of workers were maybe difficult to assess pre-pandemic because you know, if you have a more or less stable job, you're not necessarily going to go out and voice your grievances. But then when you basically lose everything, and earlier research by Sanchita shows that during the pandemic, 3/4 of workers in the garment industry did not have food on the table. I mean, it was this level of trying to survive. So I think it does a very good effort at showing what's still missing. Also highlighting some of the gaps in the way we've addressed Rana Plaza. So for example, subcontractors, as you said, so Accord and Alliance will show you a lot of numbers about how many factories, but if you look in detail, how many workers working in the garment sector are covered, we're around 30%. So actually the majority of workers, even in that industry, are still excluded from the mechanisms that were set up. And they are most probably the most vulnerable because they tend to work for the less formal or less important type of companies. So the research is interesting in that sense. It also highlights how, let's say, some of the improvements in the government sector have not really trickled down to other industries in Bangladesh. They talk about fisheries. Bangladesh has a strong fisheries industry, shipbreaking, brick kilns. I mean, some of these industries that we associate with Bangladesh that are known to be very hazardous industries. So that's a reading or a podcast I recommend. And then the last one is it's what we call an info story. I think it was published today on the ILO website. It's nicely done. It talks about occupational safety and health, obviously. This week, as it happens, also 28th of April is International Occupational Safety and Health Day. So it's really the time for you to learn about OSH. But it also looks at other issues, for example, freedom of association, which is something we discussed quite a lot in this class, the right for workers to unionize, which is still quite problematic in the context of Bangladesh. On paper, a lot of progress has been made. I was looking at the data in the garment industry. I don't know if it's specific to the garment industry, but currently about 100 new trade unions are created each year. So that could give you the idea that the freedom of association is vibrant in Bangladesh, but in reality, there is a lot of pressure, what we would call union busting or practices to try to scare workers from unionizing. And some of the famous voices of Rana Plaza, actually, who've become, union leaders, lost their job and were not able to come back into the garment industry. So this last little interactive website, info story, touches on these other type of issues. We have about 10-15 minutes. We wanted to open to the students of the class, obviously, who might have some questions, but also the other people who've joined us today. Does anyone have any question to Dorothée?
Oh, you're experts in your own right now.
I mean, I did have a question on freedom of association, but so I think you touched upon that. But maybe you have something to add on that, because I think it's interesting to understand how unions are stopped from existing. And also, I was wondering if there was no means for suppliers to also have an organization including themselves, maybe with the government, to have some demands to also the brands abroad, and if anything like that could potentially start at some point.
I start with the second question. So why don't those suppliers have their own organization to sort of bring demands to, for example, the government or the buyers? I mean, this organization exists, the BGMEA and the BKMEA, and the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association and knitting associations, which encompasses 90% of the industry, I would say. But they don't want to lose their business. Bangladesh depends so existentially on the garment industry that I don't think they're as forceful, as they could be to demand rights and higher wages, because they want the garment industry to stay in Bangladesh. So I think that's one explanation. And the role of trade unions in Bangladesh, I think it's very important to strengthen that movement, to have workers' representation, for example, through trade unions. But that movement in Bangladesh is nascent, because as Charles mentioned, there's co-opting happening, and many manufacturers are not keen on the unions because they disrupt the business in a way that's not constructive. And I think more problematically, we should ask ourselves, do these union structures actually represent workers' voices? And if they're not, they might not be the correct counterpart. The Accord made kept emphasizing that they are so different from the alliance because they had international unions and local unions in their governance structure, which the alliance didn't. Whether it actually led to better representation of workers, I'm not sure. So I think we also need to be open to other ways to ensure that workers' voices are heard. Through the accord, safety committees were established, and sometimes those safety committees are the most appropriate structure to suck up what's happening inside a company and facilitate that communication with management. It's not the same as the union, but it's a start to learn that communication with management, and maybe these type of real exchanges and real forms of giving workers voice need to be supported further.
Sorry for that.
Glad you didn't hear that.
Do we have other questions?
It was a difficult question on unions, Yeah, it's difficult.
Okay, maybe it's like more like a common question.
Yeah.
So I'm talking a lot about like how like we can make governance of these things better and like how to put formal structures and systems of monitoring and evaluation and accountability in place and all these things. But like specifically in Bangladesh, there are so many societal and cultural factors that play into this. And also if you look at the garment industry is so much intertwined to like governance and like the politicians themselves that have so much interest in the garment industry. And so there's all these like the different levels of powers and power dynamics that have to be taken into account. And the whole it's the whole system, even of like seeing the woman as like the bearer of like this job, because they're seen as more docile and like less prone to like protest and like raise their voices and things. And so it's like this whole societal thing, and obviously like it's different from country to country and everything. But I'm just like wondering, like for sure, like these people, the garment workers themselves, they have a active role in doing this, but at the same time they're kind of caged by the system because they cannot like rebel because they'll lose their jobs and things. So I'm wondering like how much can like the formal like system of garment industry and supply chain like change like from above and like top down, and how much it is societal and cultural change that like has to be done in like these ways. But at the same time, it's not that we can impose it on someone. It's something that needs to come from the country and like itself, because we don't understand the whole dynamics that are going on the ground. And so I'm just like,
it's a great question or comment, because indeed the entanglement between the garment industry and politics in Bangladesh is impressive, and that the majority of members in the Bangladesh parliament have stakes in the garment industry or are garment manufacturers themselves. It's how they make their business, and then they enter politics. And so the reform from inside out might be hampered by that situation. For brands, I think what they can do is to model different approaches. So why not promoting more female workers into supervisor positions, for example, and facilitate access to additional education and skill training. The female workers in that industry are typically not from Dhaka, they're from villages in Bangladesh, and they come to Dhaka for this work. And you can also see this as a form of empowerment to a certain degree. In principle, it could be because they are not married young. They're actually leaving for the city. They earn a wage, and if that wage would be decent, here would be a development opportunity. So I don't see this all negative. And if brands within the realm of what they can do start modeling alternatives, this might also have cultural spillover effects, because those women will demand these conditions that they once experienced in a good factory also elsewhere. I would hope for that.
Maybe also to build on that, I think it's interesting, especially as we're going to talk a little bit about what the European Parliament is doing. We talked about the duty of vigilance law in France. Basically, if you look at these different pieces of legislation, overall, they're putting, let's say, asking for greater accountability from manufacturers, which somewhere or another leads to increased cost. And here we are, I mean, for some of us, let's say in the markets, and we're not seeing such an appetite of consumers to pay more for that. So there is a very, very big economic challenge. And we've not even started to address the environmental aspect, because it's true that consumers right now are expecting the Bangladeshi made products to be eco-friendly. So the diesel generator to move to maybe, I don't know, and some other type of energy. Yes, and so it goes all the way to conversations that I heard recently, for example, in the South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights, about people from Bangladesh or Nepal or Pakistan questioning whether the pressure that is being put to advance standards in the supply chains is now going to create additional problems as well. And it's true, we're a little bit in front of a mind-boggling scenario where all of us, you know, it's like you look at Rana Plaza and you're like, never again. Mm. On the other hand, you look at the consumers in the countries where we live, and you look at the companies, and no one is really willing to pay to make that difference. So quite a lot of work involved. We have time for maybe one last question or comment before we move on. Yes, please.
I had a question about the partnership you mentioned with Decathlon and like what makes it a good partnership in your opinion.
So I looked into the purchasing practices of Decathlon because I met the country manager in Ethiopia, a country that I started exploring after many years looking into the garment supply chain in Bangladesh. And, you know, Ethiopia promised to be the new El Dorado for garment production in Africa. And I wanted to see, are the same mistakes repeated in Bangladesh, or are we actually trying to start something from scratch in Ethiopia that has decency built into business models? What I saw in Ethiopia was unfortunately not fundamentally different for most brands, but I did meet the Decathlon country manager there, who told me about purchasing practices that were quite radically different from any other brand I've encountered before, because most importantly, they said, well, we committed to sourcing from Ethiopia, and generally, as we commit to source from somewhere, we built the sourcing relationship in a way that we wanted to last minimum 5 years. It's a time horizon unheard of in that industry, where you count in months or sometimes just empty lines in a factory. Minimum 5 years, ideally 20 years or longer. And they told me they're producing around 80% of all their products with so-called strategic suppliers that have such a long-term relationship with Decathlon. So the longevity of that relationship makes a difference. Also, the fact that they have people on the ground in those factories all the time. So this country manager was like in the factories almost every day to guide them on improving quality and guide them on improving productivity and workers' wages. In their joint business plan, this was neatly mapped out. And they acknowledge that as we start this, and it's an entirely new market and the workforce is absolutely new and unskilled, we need to accept some losses. It was against something that I've never heard of before. The first 2 years, you know, we will not really make any profits. We'll just, you know, make it through. But then from then on, things should really pick up. That was their expectation. The fact that they mapped that out jointly with the supplier, I think, makes a big difference. And that they couple quality, productivity, and workers' wages was something new to me. I wrote a case study about that because it was, you know, not perfect, but interesting approaches to, for example, also bring the skill level of workers to a higher level. They invested heavily in training because they see this connection between skills, productivity, wages. They sent them easy styles first and then increased the complexity so that workers could learn. Workers that had that had always worked in agriculture and then came to an industrial setting for the first time. So these are elements, I think, that might make you know, that relationship more equal and quite promising from a human rights perspective.
Thanks a lot. Well, we'll be watching your research on that just to make sure where it leads us to. Also, we didn't have time and it was not the topic of the day, but Dorothée is looking at a number of business and human rights critical issues. I think you're in town also because There's the OECD Responsible Mineral
Yes.
Forum starting today. Dorothée was recently in DRC looking at human rights issues in cobalt mining. I assume most of you are familiar with that. Otherwise, you're not looking at the good news. So that's another big issue. I mean, when we look at it, we have clothes on ourselves and a cell phone in our hand. That's basically what we are today. So those are like huge supply chains.
Yeah.
And with massive levels of issues, and a lot of us are probably comfortable with that. I mean, that's kind of the question we need to ask ourselves.
I want to talk about, but I just want to say one thing. So the research that I do really goes to very complex business environments, and human rights risks and abuses are rampant. However, I do this research to identify solutions, both in the garment industry and in cobalt. And I think there are solutions. So these partnerships, give me sort of a glimpse into what good could look like from a purchasing practices perspective. In the cobalt context, I also identify solutions. I'm not an NGO that just documents the abuses, but I want to look at what type of business solutions companies can put in place to address those human rights issues in the cobalt context. I advocate for the formalization of artisanally small-scale mined cobalt. So I want to elaborate on these solutions and hope that companies can put them in practice.
So follow Dorothée on LinkedIn, on Twitter,
Yeah.
anywhere she's active. And I mean, just get in touch with this type of research. I think it's really great. Shannon, Ariadis, you were, I mean, great. I'm going to quit. I'll tell Mimi, who is the academic responsible here. I'll hand over my class next year to Shannon and please be seated. Dorothée as well. I'm going to invite Rafael Glucksmann to take the floor. And also, okay, we can take a 2-minute break just to get things started.
Open the window.
Open the window. Yeah, okay, you're right.
Again, we can put in.
Maybe supposed to go I didn't have that for you. I don't leave my students out because I know they never come back. Les conversations du Rwanda, on a demandé les écoles de commerce d'essayer d'utiliser la langue. So, first thing, and I want to comment a little bit some of my questions. Because students of my class who are because we share the information, but some of them don't know much. Like they don't know what the due diligence. Then I told them that both it's really like
Yeah, like I was trying to like do something like original and they're all like, yeah, nah. So I'm like, no, why do you go up?
Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the discussion, which is not fully articulated with Rana Plaza. It's going to be a little bit broader, but we thought it was really nice to try and also put the students and all the other people in the audience in touch with what's happening, not today, otherwise you'd be in Strasbourg, but what's happening really right now at the European level, let's say, around these issues. We have several pieces of legislation. We've been having for several years now pieces of legislation that look specifically at business and human rights issue. We have extra financial communication, asking companies to disclose information. And right now we have two very interesting pieces of legislation that are, let's say, in the dialogue around due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence. We're focusing a lot on human rights and labor rights in this course, but I also want to bring to your attention the fact that a lot of these legislation embed an environmental component as well. So in EU jargon, this would be CSDD or CSDD directive, corporate sustainability.
I will try not to speak weird language.
Business and human rights, BHR as we call it, is full of 3 to 4 letter acronyms, UNGPs and RBC and all of that, but we'll try to make it accessible to everyone. So thanks a lot, Raphaël Glucksmann, for taking the time to be with us. Raphaël Glucksmann is a French member of the European Parliament. We're particularly interested with the fact that you're the vice chair of the subcommittee of human rights. So we imagine that legislation like this one on human rights due diligence is debated.
Yeah, actually, I was the rapporteur, who was the responsible person for the law.
In that
for the Human Rights Committee.
For the Human Rights Committee. So that's really, really interesting. And so we have 2 students, and I'll give the floor to them, Kuan Yu and Merzuk, who will basically ask you some questions to help us understand where we are.
Hello, everyone. So this session will be led by Merzuk and I. And before we start a conversation with the speaker, we'll have a brief introduction of the subject we're planning to discuss today, and as well as the current work of Autheman. And so under the, as mentioned previously, under the scope of the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, companies have the responsibilities to undertake the due diligence in their business. However, if we have a quick look on the current status, 46% of the companies, they are not able to identify the human rights issues in their supply chain. And only less than 30% of the company that are actually doing due diligence in their operations. And plus the historical disaster, as we mentioned before, on Rana Plaza and other historical events around the areas, that's all the background that motivate or stimulate the need under for the government. So that's why the government, they start to have more regulatory control over the companies. For example, in the especially in the UN, countries like France, Germany, Netherlands, or Switzerland, they're all trying to make progress under the legal framework. And in the following, Mazuk will explain more on the proposal of CSDD in the EU.
Yeah, coming to what's interesting us for this discussion and what the main fights, the European Union proposed a directive on corporate sustainable due diligence, CSDD, which would require companies to report on their social and environmental impacts, risks, and strategy, but also identify, prevent, and mitigate those risks. So the directive really aims to ensure that businesses operating in the EU are accountable for their sustainability performance. So we talk about around 12,000 companies, so that's massive. The due diligence obligation would apply to all companies that sell goods or provide services. So under the proposed directive, companies would be required to conduct a risk assessment to identify and prioritize the most significant social and environmental risks associated with their operation and supply chain. Also take measures to prevent and mitigate those risks, including through the adoption of policies, procedures, and monitoring mechanism. Conduct regular monitoring and evaluation of their due diligence measures and report on their performance, but also provide information to stakeholders, including employees, suppliers, customers, and civil society on their due diligence efforts and their sustainability performance. In the previous part of this conference, we talked a lot about the Rana Plaza disaster, and now thanks to our comrades and Dorothy, we're all experts on that now. It was a tragic example of the human cost of inadequate due diligence in supply chain. Could you elaborate a bit on the proposed directive on CSDD, and how do you think the proposed EU directive could help prevent similar incidents in the future? And what more needs to be done to ensure that companies are held accountable to their supply chain impacts?
Well, thank you. Are you ready for a very long lecture? So first, I'm very happy. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be here. And you will have to forget my French accent. You know, if you are born with it, you can't get rid of it. So if you have trouble to understand French English, and ask for a translation. Yes, the idea is quite clear. It's that we want to put an end to this pyramid of irresponsibility that globalization has shaped. And we want the law and the rights to follow the facts. And the facts are that due to a race to a lower possible production cost, the value chains have been exploded, and companies that are selling goods here, like Zara or like Nike, are not producing their goods themselves. They are having suppliers. I guess you are all familiar with that, and they are not producing their suppliers, and in fact the crimes committed on their value chain, nobody is responsible for them as we speak. And the idea is to make sure that there is a responsibility somewhere. And first with those who are making money out of this production. So you had the Rana Plaza, you had a growing attention in the international community, NGOs, about this fact that we are living in a world of irresponsibility and that it has to come to an end, and that people who make money out of production of shirts or shoes should be held responsible for whatever happens on their value chain in some way or another. And this has grown, and it led to several countries to pass legislation. lots of flaws in this legislation that we have studied, but at least it was like precursor. And then it also led international organizations like the OECD to produce guidelines and create a momentum for this kind of legislation. And so the growing spirit in the European Union is that we could be the leaders in actually passing legislation on due diligence and make sure that we can use the power of our market to actually become a global normative power. And that EU is the right scale if you want to confront multinationals with exploded value chain. Because actually nobody can ignore EU market, neither producing countries nor multinational. And so you had this growing thing, and you had campaigns, you had also a growing issue, which leads to a differentiation that's quite important, and I think we'll come back to it. A growing issue, for instance, state-sponsored forced labor in Uyghur region in China, and the fact that you had a list of multinational companies actually benefiting from the Chinese concentration system and enslavement of a nation. And so all of this created a momentum for this legislation. And right now, where we stand in the European Union, we have two projects that are discussed as I'm speaking: due diligence and import ban on products of forced labor. And these are two projects aiming at the same goal, but with very different methods, and that should be separated. Import ban, in a way, it's simpler. Import ban, it's what exists more or less in the US. It's the idea that you block products of forced labor at the entrance to your market. Of course, in Europe, we always make things more complicated, so it's not really an import ban, it's a withdrawal mechanism, which means that you block them, but you also take them out from the market when they're inside, and you don't target a specific region, it's universal. At the same time, it can be more efficient, less efficient. I mean, we have this great discussion as we speak. And the idea is that it's a product-based trade instrument. So you don't care about the size of the company, the processes, you just care this product that is in my shop, entering in my market, at my customs, or where I'm buying in Galeries Lafayette. Is it made out of forced labor or not? And so the idea is that it should be sharp. If it's yes, then it's out. It's taken out, and it goes from, of course, garments, but also solar panel, as we speak, and many other products. On this one, I'm rapporteur for the International Trade Committee. You know, when you are an MEP, you are in different committees. And so this one is a trade instrument, and I'm working on it for the International Trade Committee. The other one, the due diligence, is a more complicated file involving a lot of committees, and it's about company legislation. So it's about the processes of the company, how a company makes sure that it checks its value chain and is held responsible for the impacts. I mean, that's what we call it in the text, negative impacts on human rights, social rights, and environmental rights on the whole value chain. This text has been fiercely negotiated. First, we had a directive coming. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the EU system. I mean, I think more or less you have studied it, yes? So first, the Commission proposed a directive, then it comes to the Parliament, we are taking it on board. Actually, it's more complicated even. First, we issue an initiative, which we did, very progressive one. Then the Commission translates it into a directive, much less progressive one. And then we take it back, and suddenly we discover, so we have lots of committees working on the text, and suddenly we discover that not everybody is still so progressive. because now it becomes concrete, when you have a general declaration of principle that the parliament wants to have a due diligence legislation, then everybody is like super active and ambitious. And then suddenly you have lobbies and discussions. And now we are entering in the 7th month of discussion, and we came to an agreement. So it's going to be voted this week in URI, which is the Legal Affairs Committee, and then in plenary. But that's not, and then we can enter into what we came out as with an agreement, but it's not over because it's EU. So then you have what we call trilogues, which means discussions between parliaments, came with its own legislation, commission, which has seen its legislation being redrafted and destroyed and changed, and council, which is member states. And all the three have to agree before it becomes the legislation that enters into force and that has to be translated in 27 member states legislation. So this is not the end of the process, but we will have this before the end of the mandate, and this is already a huge progress by that we have it at the European level, that it's mandatory, that it covers the entire value chain of companies, because you had huge pressure so that it will not, and that's just a first tier and direct provider, supplier, and that it's going to have effective sanctions if you don't comply. Of course, I mean, in my committee, in the Human Rights Committee, I guess because we are the Human Rights Committee, so we care a bit about human rights. What we had was much more ambitious than what will come out as a general compromise between all committees. I mean, basically, we had the perspective of trials of bosses of multinational held responsible for everything that allowed them to make money out of their shoes and shirts. Not going to be exactly like that at the end, but at least you will have effective sanctions, and you will have a possibility of access to justice. You will have remediation. I mean, in our version now, I told you, then you still have to convince member states and commission. You will have remediations for those who have been victims of human rights, social rights, or environmental rights abuses. And you will have an obligation for companies above the size of 250 employees, and for companies that are not Europeans above, I think, 150 million turnover. So you will have the obligation to have due diligence and to comply and to remediate and to face consequences. And this is a huge change. Of course, as I'm speaking to you now, I'm slightly frustrated, as you can understand, but still you will have to see it from the historical perspective, that during dozens of years, you had nothing. And now you will have the biggest market in the world producing this kind of norms. And that's a very purpose, I think, of the European Union. It's to be able to put back some rules into the jungle of race for lower possible cost of production and biggest possible margins and biggest possible dividends for shareholders. I mean, you need to have some limits, and the EU, I think, is today the only power that is able to put these limits. So that's a huge step forward. And if we have both import ban, sharp trade instruments on products, and due diligence, I think finally we will have shown that we can do something else than just consume goods. We can also have an impact on human rights, environment, and on. But that's a general change. I'm sorry, I'm wrong, but they have changed right now in the EU that even the most pro-market people understand that you need some norms, and it fits the narrative also with directive on deforestation product. I don't know if you heard about that. So that's all of that is connected, and this is a positive change for once. Sorry.
No, actually, just regarding the negotiation you just mentioned, here comes our second question. It's reported that French government had attempted to expel financial sectors from this proposal. And since financial institutions like investment or banks, they're the key role to play in financing these activities or projects that might violate human rights or cause even more significant impact on climate change. So what's from your opinion, from your view, how is it likely to be passed, and what's the impact if it passes or not passed?
Yeah, your information are quite correct, I must say. You had an attempt by the French government in the council on two things on due diligence. First, it's financial sector, and the second one was because so you have a value chain. It's supply chain is upstream, and then you have the downstream side. So what's the use of what you produce? For instance, if you produce a video surveillance system, and then it's used by a totalitarian regime to actually persecute the opponents, are you going to be held responsible for that or not? So France is actually a great producer of weapons. And so they were a bit slightly worried about the downstream side of value chain. And they managed actually they lost on the financial sector, but they managed to put limits to the downstream responsibility. I mean, in a way, I can understand the logics for limiting the downstream. For instance, if you produce a good and then you have a user that's using it for bad purpose, which was not the aim of the good your product, I mean, it's hard to hold the company fully responsible for the use of its product. And for me, the most important thing was to be coherent on the supply chain, on the upstream, and to include financial sector. So if I had to lose on one of the two, I would rather lose on the downstream discussion than on the financial sector, because financial sector is huge in its impact. And I know why they wanted to exclude it, because I mean, politics is like that. I mean, you have the boss of BNP Paribas who calls you and say, oh, you understand, I mean, it's quite complicated, this story. And I mean, you were not elected there because you were a leftist human rights activist. I mean, you are responsible for the health of our financial sector, and it's very dangerous, whatever. And what will Americans and Chinese do? I mean, if we Europeans are the ones to be checked by that. But the truth is, the impact of the financial sector on human rights, on environmental issues, especially, it's gigantic. So if you exclude them, then you have a huge hole in your legislation, and you can't do that. So that will be one of the points, because in the deal in the parliament, and it will be voted because we have a large consensus now around this deal, thanks to the concessions we had to make, which makes me still angry. But that's life. I mean, you need a majority. Yeah. I mean, I would be happy to be alone, but I'm not. I mean, democracy is sometimes complicated. Yeah. And then we managed to have a deal including the financial sector. So now that will be the huge debate with the council in the next step trials, but we can't give in on this one, and even a conservative agree. So that's okay. You know.
And I think it's been, I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the debate, it's been quite public as well. I mean, this is not confidential information. And it's also led to a lot of, let's say, scholars or academics or, let's say, thought leaders in the field of human rights due diligence think about it. It's true, it's the role of the financial sector, it's massive. There are some technical, it's a little bit like the downstream metaphor. It's, financial institutions as such, when they give out a loan, could say, well, we don't necessarily know, what is being made out of the money, but still today there is an important consensus around the fact that it could transform this legislation into one that has teeth, that has impact.
Yeah.
Or one that basically will exclude a lot of actors that have such huge decisions to be made, that their decisions, when they trickle down, have a huge impact.
Without revealing secrets, when you have a negotiation like that, so for instance, you have EPP as a conservative party with its dominant force in the European Parliament. And they come and they have a huge mission for them, which is to exclude SMEs from the legislation. And we
small and medium-sized companies.
Yeah, and we were for a risk-based approach, which means that you don't put the size as a determinant factor, but the risk of negative impact. And they were also hostile to include the financial sector. So then what you have to do, and it's always frustrating and complicated, is to understand, okay, what's the main thing? What's the main thing I want to fight for? And so what we did is we had to give him partially our risk-based approach, agree to exclude the companies under 250 employees, and in exchange they gave to us the financial system, and that's how you do deals, because otherwise you can't have a majority. And my thinking and our thinking in general was that it's better to have the most coherent piece of legislation possible, even if you exclude small and medium enterprise. And because then if you show that it works and that it's not what people say that, oh my God, we will collapse on those bureaucratic rules and everything, and it has an impact, then you can extend. But the problem is that if you do a general one with lots of holes, it will never work. So you will never be able to prove that it's actually working. and therefore it will just be another piece of paper. So what we decided is focus on coherence, even if you exclude a lot of companies from that.
So you might have mentioned one question that we try to address in the first part of the conference, a problematic question, which is the remedy question. And last week, a bill was reached under the Parliament, European Parliament Committee on Legal Affairs, on this question of remedies to victims of inadequate due diligence, but also trade unions, NGOs, and human rights activists, which would lead to companies that aren't really in the due diligence obligation to maybe face fines and see their products taken away from the European market, and really emphasize the importance of access to remedies for individuals and communities affected by corporate activities. How do you think this requirement could be effectively enforced and implemented in practice, and how we can ensure that all individuals impacted can have access to remedies?
Yeah, that's also a big discussion, because it was not part of the Commission's proposal, and we insisted on introducing this question of remediation. And actually, some of the businesses are supporting this. This is quite interesting that in this debate we were supported by some of the businesses, because they see it as a way to clean themselves. I mean, if you are cynical, which is good, and you have to to make them understand that that's the most immediate way to produce an impact and reverse the negative impact, the positive impact, and reverse the negative impact that they had on the ground. And so we will find support on this debate. And for us, it was very important. And by the way, that's one of the difference between the two pieces of legislation. And you know, I mean, usually I'm a hardliner and pro NGO. You know, and my guys are really crazy. We go for it. But on the import ban issue, I'm much more skeptical about introducing remediation because I think it should be a sharp instrument and it will be a process. And the problem of NGO communities in general is that they are a bit like European civil servants. They love processes. And because processes gives everybody a good reason to exist. Yeah, but then what's the results? That's my point, is that if you start endless processes, then you don't have direct results. So if you insert, for instance, remediation issue in the import ban, and then what you have to do is to start a process of remediation before products are seized. And then they will never be seized because you will have endless processes. While in the due diligence, it should be a core part of the due diligence itself, that a company identifying or being identified as having a negative impact should be led to remediate to this impact. Example, World Cup, Qatar, construction of stadiums, migrant workers dying and being used as slaves. Then you need European companies that were involved in, or not European companies, but you need companies that were involved in the process of building stadiums to engage in an effective remediation for migrants, families, and this is perfectly doable. So that would be a point of tough debate in the months to come in what we call the trials, which are the most horrific trials. It's you have council, commission, and parliament at the table, and then it's like a piece of theater. You know, you have to get out of the table saying there will be no deal, and the first one who blinks loses. And I hope we will have the strength time to keep all of that in the text.
Yes, so you also mentioned about on the other pillar of this global framework, which is the forced labor ban, which work mainly on national design authorities by each member states. Can that create some disparities between member states on the will to?
You are ready to answer the European.
Maybe for the next.
Yeah, but exactly. That's our main problem. It's always the main problem when you decide something at the EU level, is a disparity of implementation, which will lead to problems because import ban, it's a very clear instrument. Yes, so you have products, you identify them because you have substantiated concerns about their provenance and the fact that they were made with forced labor. You start an investigation. The company has to prove that it's not made out of forced labor, otherwise you seal the good. But for that to happen, you need national authorities to actually implement it with goodwill and efficiency. And so what I have started to do is to go to ports, for instance, in Europe, and speak to customs. And what I've seen is that you have a great disparity of excitement with this measure between, for instance, let's say, French or Belgian customs, which are adamant to do that. And for instance, when you go to the port of Rotterdam, because they have shaped their business model is to let everything enter. So, and then redistribute in Europe. And that's really super important for Netherlands And so how much will they will show, goodwill they will show to implement that, that's one of the main issue. So what we do in the parliament, because on this one, we have a good proposal from the commission, which I will not say it was the case for due diligence. And we are just putting more garde-fou, I don't know, safeguards. So that's you have a harmonization of implementation, but it means giving more tasks to the European Commission. And the problem that despite everything populists are saying in our countries, you don't have a huge administration in the European Union. You don't have a huge budget for the European Union. Actually, it's quite poor. And they have a lot of things to do already. And every time Parliament gives them more tasks, but not more budget. So, I mean, I don't know how much, you know, we are in between. We ask the EU to produce rules. Yes, because we want rules and we know it's in the right size. We want to change things. Yes, great. Fantastic. Due diligence, deforestation, cleaning of foreign direct investment, reciprocity, mirror clauses, blah, 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 sustainable development clauses in the FTAs, blah, blah, great, import ban. But who is doing that? Yes, and we are in between. We don't have still yet federal level of government. We have just a facilitation body that is the Commission. And we have so much more requests from the public and from us. So, yes, you will have an issue because we still did not make the choice. If you want harmonization, then it has to be implemented at the European level. But for that, you need an administration at the European level, which you don't have as we speak. So that's always the problem. I mean, we are not the US where the federal government can say yes. We do that. And then you have thousands of custom officers implementing something. Here, you say we do that, and then you have phone calls to national authorities, and some of them say, I don't really care.
I mean, just to mention for those who are not familiar with the import bans, that because you mentioned the US as well, it's interesting. I mean, maybe for the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, we're more trying to experiment. This is rather, let's say, new duty of vigilance law in France is 2017, Modern Slavery Act in the UK is 2015. So we don't have a lot of experience. All of these processes, by the way, experimenting exactly what you described, let's say a strong proposal at the beginning, which was watered down to something that you can question the effects. I don't know if some of you have been following recent cases on duty of vigilance law here in France, but basically we have a law that is considered to be very efficient, but that in court is not leading to any concrete decision. So if I'm managing risk in a big company, well, it's a beautiful law, but the sense of impunity is still quite strong. But for the Tariff Act, it's a bit different. The US, Tariff Act, sorry, the import ban. The US has a similar instrument that has been existing for some time, actually. The Section 307 of the US Tariff Act, which is from the 1930s, right at the beginning of when the international community within the ILO started thinking about forced labor. The US put the idea that if there is a convention, which the US has not ratified, that's another debate, but if there is a convention on forced labor, then doesn't that have implications for our trade? If we say we outlaw forced labor, then can we have goods coming into our country that are made with forced labor? That section of the Tariff Act in the US was never really applied for a long period of time until 2016. And a major scandal, again, coming from outsourcing practices, let's say, more related to seafood. And but we're seeing right now how effective a tool it can be. Just to give you one example, during the pandemic, one of the main PPE, protective plastic equipment for hospitals, which was a Malaysian companies, was under this tariff act. So goods were stopped in the American harbors, and that led to first massive health issues in the US related to COVID, which maybe legislators had not envisaged, that people would be actually dying because they didn't have masks and rubber gloves anymore. But more interestingly, with what we're talking about, it led to very, very strong changes in those Malaysian palm oil plantations and, let's say, companies that were producing these equipment. So I would tend to agree with, workers that worked in forced labor for these plantations, they're not necessarily any better off today than they were. But those companies, Top Glove in this case, for example, had to completely transform their operations. So that can be pretty effective.
Yeah, and the two things you mentioned are very important. First, so the impact of the import ban is indirect. It means that you just shut down, and then as a result, companies have to change their value chain. Otherwise, they can't access your market anymore. So it leads to results, but you don't handle them. Due diligence is the contrary. I mean, you handle changes, and that's why remediation fits perfectly in due diligence. The second thing is the impact you have. I mean, just because it doesn't mean we should not do it. I mean, I'm a huge fighter for it, but import ban. We vote subventions to the Green Deal. Yeah. So we say like, okay, renewable. Hundreds of billions of investment in renewable. As we speak, it's a direct subvention to the Chinese production apparatus, of course, because we don't produce anything anymore in Europe. I mean, almost anything. And we are state dependent. But solar panels are made out of polysilicon, which is produced by Uyghurs in forced labor conditions. So if you do the import ban, you block the solar panels coming from China at your border. So how do you do the Green Deal without Chinese solar panels? I mean, and this is going to be huge headaches, which means we should do it, but we should understand the impact, the huge impact it will have, which means that then the Green Deal needs also to be an industrial project to make sure we are not totally dependent on forced labor scheme in China who have solar panels. So, it's when you move legislation on one aspect, you think it's perfect, and from the human rights perspective, great, but then you have to understand the impact of the moves you are making and reshape your policies in other fields. So it's directly connected, for instance, to our industrial policy or our trade policy in general, but our industrial policy. And this is something that is really important because, and that's why also at the beginning I was very hostile to the delays, because for instance, import ban, you will have a 2 years delay between the moment we vote and the moment it's implemented. And for due diligence, it's 3, 4, and 5 years. The delay for implementation, depending on the size of the company. But if we use this delay to reshape other parts of our policies, then it's not a waste of time.
We've got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to open the floor if there are some questions in the room. Yes, please.
Just to follow up on the last thing you were saying, how do you manage for workers and manufacturers not to assume the burden in, for example, the policy of the import ban? So to protect the last chain of the value chain in order for them not to be the ones assuming the extra cost of those policies.
So you mean the extra costs? You mean that if you block the products, then they will be left without a job? Yeah. I mean that's a huge issue of the import ban, and you can't manage that. So basically, the bets you make that if you go on buying if you go on buying stuff as we are doing now, then you perpetuate the system. If you stop the system, then you will have for sure a negative impact at the beginning. And that's you handle it in the due diligence, in the import ban. It's very complicated to handle. So because in due diligence, for instance, termination of contract is the last resort. So all the due diligence is about changing the conditions on the ground, remediates to adverse impacts, and really last resort, you terminate the contract if the conditions can't allow you to actually have neither of these processes in place. For instance, if you are in a situation of state sponsor forced labor scheme, I mean, obviously, you will not, through a due diligence process, change the policy of Chinese Communist Party towards Uyghurs. But in Bangladesh, it's different. You know, it's not the same thing. It's the purchasing policies of European companies that led also to this forced labor, which is different from China's situation, for instance. So in the Bangladesh situation, if you just wash your hands and say I'm leaving, then you have a disastrous impact. But in China, certain sectors, certain regions, you can't change things on the ground. And you can't even have the investigation to do that. So you should have two different policies, but the import ban side, it will be of course a negative impact here and there, and that's how you evaluate the situation. That's why some people oppose it. But if you want to have a result, that's the only way. And then what you think will happen is the Malaysian case, is that then companies themselves, I mean, they will lose so much money that they will have to prove, and the only place where we can put in the import ban some form of remediation is to lift the ban. To lift the ban, companies will show that they have changed their value chain, reorganized, respect rules, and remediate for victims. And then you lift the ban on the products. So your bet is that your market is so attractive for them, so necessary for them, that in-out will be the stimulus to change.
By the way, the Malaysian ban that I was referring to, I mean, the Malaysian case, the recent one in the US, it was quite a short ban. So if you go to the Customs and Borders Patrol website, you can look at the bans that have been enforced under this legislation, and most of them are actually quite short. And if you look at it, I mean, the main results was that Top Glove, the company, lost a quarter of its valuation in the stock markets on the very day of the ban. So immediate financial risk, hence the relationship also with, do you put the financial sector in or out? If today there's no de-incentive to investing in companies that misbehave, because I mean, that company is generating good stocks. And then the second people who suffered was the people in American hospitals, actually, from that ban. So
but I mean, 90% of the impact of law is deterrence. So you will have 5, 6, 7, 8 big cases like this one, and then it will have a deterring effect, and people will start to look seriously and not just for show up and produce nice documents on their website on their web chain.
we have another, we'll take this last question, please. Yeah.
Well, I've got two questions. A short follow-up to the potential and negative socioeconomic effects on the last part of the value chain. You said that the ending of the contracts would be a last resort, but also, are you thinking in a policy like broader, also maybe in a bundle of other policies, and how you can think more broadly in kind of a transformation of these value chains and like trade policies and development cooperation, these sort of things, and how you think about it? And also, how do you think about, well, industries for whom the European market is not the biggest market, and they might just say, well, then we don't export to Europe anymore.
Yeah, so on the first one, yes, it should be part of a general vision, and as well as it has an impact on industrial policy, then it needs to be part of development strategy and policy. And that's why when you take a look at which committees were involved in the European Parliament, you had almost all committees, because for me, the due diligence is a global change. So it has to involve other components, of course, and development strategy and cooperation. And for the second one, yes, you're right. I mean, but we don't have a cosmopolitan government. That's the biggest scale we have is the EU. So you will have, for instance, I'm sure that some of the Chinese suppliers we have identified as using forced labor. At the end of the day, they will have to make a choice, but they might perfectly decide that they don't care, and that they go on with their strategy, and they will have find other places to export. But what we have learned from the American import ban, that we became the garbage of the world, basically, like Europe, because goods that were at risk and entering the US market were redirected directly to Europe. So as we speak now, we are the garbage, and it's time to just a bit cut rules so that we stop being this garbage, and which means being a complicit of crimes that can amount to crimes against humanity. I mean, when you shop, you can be directly linked to a crime against humanity. So, I mean, this is something that we have to do. And then, of course, now we are in a situation, and it might change, but we're in a situation that it's quite still complicated for multinationals or big producers to totally ignore the European market. You know, when we speak about our dependency to China, never forget it's an interdependency. I mean, they will also have a huge turnover if markets start to close themselves in Europe. And so this is a way in, way out. I mean, the thing is that we need to do it now, because your questions will be more serious in 10 years from now. And by the way, this is also something I keep saying, because of course I have a lot of lobbyists coming and trying to explain to me that my behavior is quite dangerous, and but I'm always saying them that it's a total misunderstanding, because I am the best defender of European businesses doing so, of course, and even Zara or Nike or all the other fast fashion or sportswear people. If you don't have these rules, then at the end of the day, in 10 years, Zara does not exist anymore. It will be everywhere, Shein, whatever we call it. Because if you don't have any rules, then they would be better at competition. They would just scrap any cost and don't care about any form of even bad publicity. So if you want to still have some of these brands surviving, they need rules. Of course, these rules will oblige them to change. But it's either they change or they disappear. And so by putting this rule, it's not anti-business. It's even protecting themselves from the rules that they have shaped, and that will actually lead them to bankruptcy very soon. So that's the idea. Just cut down a bit your margins now, and you will continue to exist for a while. If you play this game, you will lose at this game.
Okay, so Raphael, we meet on 24 April 2033 in 10 years' time to see if Zara still exists and where we are. But I mean, I think the linkages with the first part of the discussion were really interesting. We've come to the end of this conversation. First of all, I'd like a warm round of applause to Guan Yu, Merzouk, and Raphael. Obviously, I mean, thanks a lot for taking the time. I wanted to highlight also on the last question. So Zineb, which was the co-lecturer for this class, is currently in Japan for the G7 discussions, the labor employment discussions, and the same way the EU was the garbage. I mean, that's the metaphor, but previous to the EU, actually, when the US, they started putting pressure on Canada and Mexico because under NAFTA, they were seeing that the products they were banning were coming in through Canada and Mexico. So what we're seeing both on the bans, especially within the G7, this has been a topic of discussion, but also on human rights due diligence. The Australian legislation is not perfect, but at the end of the day, you don't have a lot of companies that don't have any market in G7 or G20 countries. So now it's kind of becoming impossible. It's going to get tough and rough. I hope that you've seen today how Rana Plaza, with the disaster associated to it, was a starting point for a lot of people, and that's really important. We're commemorating 10 years today, so it's important also for us to look back at history, not just 10 years ahead, but 10 years back. Also to the students of the class, I wanted to thank you for these 12 weeks. It was great to have these conversations. This is our last class, so now I go on holiday. I wanted to say, Mai Wen, a warm round of applause. She got 20 on her exam. She's the only student who got 20. Yeah, get a public round of applause for that. No, it was great. I hope, I mean, these issues with Dorothée, we're really advocating for these issues to come into institutions like Sciences Po and business schools more proactively. You have to understand that people that will be managing companies tomorrow are very little familiar with what is happening, not only in the European Parliament, but in the details of the European Parliament. Excluding SMEs from CSDD is a lot of acronyms, but it's huge implications. And we're, as citizens, European citizens, we're just witness of, oh, like something small happened. No, it's something huge that is happening. So I hope for all of you, get familiar with those debates, follow our lecturers on social media and whenever they're talking, and read their books, and good luck for the Grand Oral.